last week I introduced our topic for the month of July, and we're going to be getting reacquainted with the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a major influence on our Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore back in the 1800s. Emerson was born on May 25th, 1803, and he followed in his father's footsteps, became a Unitarian minister, and served at a church in Boston. Now, we hear the word Unitarian today, and we get a certain picture, right? We think of Unitarians today as being essentially non-denominational, politically, very liberal, not much of a Christian identity at all. Totally different back in Emerson's day. The Unitarians back then were actually very religious, very Christian, and they turned out to be a bad match for Emerson because he was a bit of a free thinker. He lasted about 3 years as a Unitarian minister before he decided that he had to step down because it was just too confining and a little bit too restrictive for him. So he became a very popular lecturer and author, and his key focus was this idea that the individual human being is able to make decisions for themselves about what is true, good, and beautiful. Each individual human being, by right of consciousness, has the right to make those decisions for themselves without having to rely exclusively on the revelations of some religious authority figure or the pronouncements of Scripture. And because of that, they called him an atheist. They accused him of poisoning young men's minds, all because he didn't believe that the miracles of the Bible were literally true. And he said things like, well, Jesus was a great man, but he wasn't God. Terrible, terrible things that he said about Jesus. Like this. He said, Jesus Christ belonged to the true race of prophets. He saw with open eye the mystery of the soul. Drawn by its severe harmony, ravaged with its beauty, he lived in it, and he had his being there. Alone in all history, he estimated the greatness of man. One man was true to what is in you and me. He saw that God incarnates himself in man and evermore goes forth anew to take possession of his world.
Wow.
What a terrible, terrible thing, huh?
No.
My goodness. And you have to take your time with that, don't you? That's something that I almost have to run through it a couple of times before it can really settle in and the depth of it can really come through, because that's not a sound bite. That's not a sound bite. You have to take it in slowly and sit with it in order to really appreciate it, what he's trying to say. Now, this was part of an address that he gave to the graduating class at the Harvard Divinity School back in 1838, July 15th, 1838 to be exact. And of course, they ran him out of there after he said that. They banned him from speaking there for another 30 years. That's how shocking and heretical that kind of talk was considered back then. It doesn't sound so heretical to us, does it? It sounds familiar. It brings up some familiar things. When I hear that, when I read that, I think, gosh, this author had a much deeper and more profound understanding of the significance of the life and teachings of Jesus than those who want to put him up on a pedestal and worship him as a god. I listen to this, I read this, I can hear echoes of Emerson when I read Discover the Power Within You by Eric Butterworth. This idea that God incarnates himself in man. I hear Charles Fillmore when I read this. Charles Fillmore, who used the word the Christ as meaning our potential human perfection, our innate divinity. Or we can go back even earlier than Fillmore, and we can hear the words of Emily Cady from Lessons in Truth in all of this when she talks about our indwelling divinity or our innate perfection. Listen to this. She says, Christ in you, the hope of glory, the secret place of the Most High, where each one of us may dwell and be safe from all harm or fear of evil, is the point of mystical union between man and spirit, or God in us, wherein we no longer believe but know that God in Christ abides always at the center of our being as our perfect health, deliverance, prosperity, power, ready to come forth into manifestation at any moment we claim it. We know it. You hear Emerson in that. Where spiritual and material meet. That point of mystical union between God and man, where spiritual and physical meet, where the tangible and intangible aspects of reality come together. Emerson was writing and speaking about this long before Emily Cady and Fillmore and Butterworth, and I think his work can provide us with a wonderful perspective on some of our core teachings in unity. The essay that got me going here is one that's called The Oversoul, which he wrote in 1841, and actually it's just a paragraph really of that whole essay that we're going to be working with. We've put the entire paragraph in the handout in your bulletin. I invite you to take it home with you and read it over and over again. Let it settle in so maybe we can be more familiar with it for our future installments on this topic. But for today, we're going to focus on just the first 4 lines of this paragraph we're working with. I'm going to put them up here on the screen now. So here it is, the first 4 lines of our paragraph from the Oversoul. The supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, is that great nature in which we rest, as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere. That unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other. Sit with that for a little while. Does this style of writing seem a little bit foreign to us today? It's one of the challenging things about reading the works of the authors from the 1800s, whether it's Emerson or Emily Cady for that matter. There was a whole different style of writing. I mean, think about what life was like back in the 1800s. No radio, no telephone, no TV, no movies, no internet, no recordings. Even the telegraph was barely in use. Communication was accomplished by the written word and live lectures. In fact, that's what people did for entertainment back in those days. They would go to a lecture hall and listen to someone speak, someone like Ralph Waldo Emerson or Mark Twain back in the days. Writing and speaking were much more ornate than we're used to, because imagine having to address a huge crowd without a microphone, and then you have to hold their attention for an hour or longer, which is how long some of these lectures would go on for. Speakers would put a lot of effort into making their language ornate. There were flourishes to it that we just don't see today. They wanted to make their words pleasing to both the eye when you read it and the ear when you hear it. So that means that when we read something from the era of Emerson, we have to slow down. We have to treat it like the poetry that it really is. It's written like prose, but it really is poetry. And I think we've really gotten out of touch with poetry in this day and age. I mean, when's the last time anybody ever sat down and intentionally read a poem? Not too many. Not too many. Sometimes it's helpful when we're dealing with the work of Emerson, and I would also add helpful if you're reading any of the early works of Charles Fillmore or Emily Cady, to actually read it out loud to yourself. Somehow it tends to make more sense that way. And indeed, a lot of these things were meant to be delivered in the lecture hall, so that can help sometimes. And think about this paragraph from Emerson. Let's put that back up here again, those first 4 lines. It's poetic, isn't it? That's poetry. That's poetry. The supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, is that great nature in which we rest. In other words, who gets to determine the true, the good, and the beautiful? Who is it that gets to discern or tell right from wrong and determine what it is that we are supposed to do with our lives, what we're supposed to do in the future? It is that great nature in which we rest. As the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere, that unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other. And he is indeed talking about nature. He's talking about the natural world around us that we're a part of, the great nature that sustains us, it contains us, and it ultimately connects us in a larger unity, that thing we call oneness. For Emerson, and this was kind of a radical idea again at the time, for Emerson, God is not separate from nature. And therefore, spiritual truth can be intuitively experienced directly from nature. Which means no middleman is necessary, no scripture, no special revelation. Go straight to source, or as Charles Fillmore would say, go to headquarters. Right where you are in that great nature in which you rest. Always. And one word that kind of jumps out at you there, did you notice it? You see the word unity? It's actually capitalized in the original, and although I really can't say for sure, I would bet a few bucks that this might be where Charles Fillmore got the name that he chose for this movement. Now, Charles doesn't make any specific reference to this, but it may well have stuck with him at a subconscious level and could have been an influence on what he was thinking when he came up with the name. And the point, though, is that the point here is that we already have everything we need to create a better experience of life and lift ourselves out of the inevitable struggle and conflict that's around us. We have everything we need. It's within us. It's all around us. The great nature that we're made of, which at the same time surrounds us and contains us, offers us everything that we need to reduce the fear, the suffering, whatever it is that comes with existence that causes us that anxiety. Those of you who were part of Spirit Wind last month when they were discussing existentialism, they have something called existential angst, right? It seems like existence brings with it a certain amount of anxiety. The Buddhists, they keyed in on it with the first noble truth where they say that life is suffering. Sounds a little harsh, but the truth is that reality brings with it certain things we'd rather avoid, and often can't. Things like pain, sickness, old age, death. I don't care how much positive thinking you do, stick your hand in that flame, you will get burned. Climb up on the roof, step off, you're going to fall. I have yet to meet anyone who can keep this pen from falling to the floor when I let go of it. Let's give it a try. Here we go. Darn. I've tried that before. I'd really love to see it hanging there in the middle of the air. But that just doesn't happen without trickery. Reality must be respected. We have to learn how to live in right relationship with reality, but we don't have to be victims. Pain and suffering may be inevitable, or pain may be inevitable, but the suffering is optional, or it's at least manageable. Emerson developed 3 practices that he used to help people to learn how to be at home in that great nature, to rest in it instead of being anxious and afraid. That's something worth learning. First of all, he says that we use the power of imagination and creativity to shape our experience of reality. Imagination and creativity. You know, it's so easy to slip into a way of thinking that sees the world as this independent, malicious power that can destroy our plans, something separate from us, something independent and malicious, instead of something that we rest in, that actually nurtures us. The question we so often hear being asked is this one: is the universe a friendly place? Is it a friendly place, or is it out to get me? We get to choose how to answer that question. And I think it helps to think about the universe in terms of what I like to call the big picture. A few years back, I came across the work of Thomas Berry, who was a Catholic priest and a scientist who specializes in cosmology. And one of his quotes really stuck with me. He said this. He said, "The universe has a violent as well as a harmonious aspect, but it is consistently creative in the larger arc of its development." The challenge is to pay attention, learn how to work consistently within that larger creative arc of the universe. Doesn't mean we ignore the other stuff. It means we feel our feelings, we acknowledge there's pain, there's loss, there's conflict in the world, and then we shift our focus to the truth that this universe is in a constant state of creativity, a constant state of finding new ways to bring life and light to more things. Imagination, creativity, they're closely related. Imagination and creativity are what help us to bridge the gap between what's real and what's possible. Imagination and creativity can help us to move from facts to ideas. We want to join the universe in that constant state of creativity, which is why it's so important to have some kind of a creative pursuit in life. That's really, I think, what Emerson is getting at. Find a creative outlet. Art, music, writing, cooking, gambling, building things. I just wanted to see if you were listening. Building things, whatever it is, the list can be endless. Anything to exercise and stretch the imagination just a bit. That's all it takes. And if you're not feeling particularly creative yourself, learn how to appreciate that creativity and imagination in others. Art galleries, concerts, and things like that. Great ways to do that. Anyone here know who Adam Savage is? Adam Savage? He's the co-star of a favorite TV show of mine called Mythbusters. Does he look a little more familiar now? Have you seen Mythbusters? He and his partner get together to conduct experiments to prove and disprove different kinds of myths. And it's really very scientific. A lot of engineering and things come forth. And of course, what they usually do ends up with some kind of a huge explosion or a car crash, which is really the bonus. But it's all in the name of science. And you actually learn something in the midst of all the chaos, noise, and explosions. It's amazing. Well, Adam Savage, yeah, there's a few examples of some of the fun things they get to do. I saw this show for the very first time and I thought, oh my God, these guys get paid to do this? Well, Adam in particular, the guy on the right, that's Adam on the right there, he's become an outspoken advocate for getting creativity back in our schools. Think about this. When school budgets are cut, what are the first things that usually go? Exactly. Art, theater, music, shop classes and things like that. They tend to keep the math and some semblance of science in there because they've got to teach to these tests and things like this. But the rest of the stuff, art, theater, music, shop classes, anything that involves imagination, creativity, and making and building things gets cut. And Adam Savage says that's the reason the United States has started to fall so far behind the rest of the world when it comes to science and math. I think he's right. I think he's right. It's crucial. Imagination and creativity aren't only necessary for our spiritual health, they're necessary for the health and the viability of our economy, if you care about such things. They're necessary for our physical and our spiritual well-being, our economic well-being. Practicing imagination and creativity can make the universe a more friendly and prosperous place, a more interesting and enjoyable place. So what we're teaching here all comes together in a way that is practical and tangible. So this week, go out and try it for yourself. Bake a cake from scratch. Get a big pad of paper and draw something. Get a bunch of flowers. Make a flower arrangement. Go and drag that dusty old guitar out of the closet and go twang on it and have a good time with it. Whatever it takes, try it for yourself. Come back next week and we'll get into the next two of Emerson's practices and see how you feel after a little creativity and imagination. See you next week. Thank you.